Closed for the Season, Chapter 4. On Main Street, we passed a bunch of truly boring stores: an insurance agency, an office supply store, and Mrs. De Silvo's real estate office, its windows plastered with photos of houses. It was the only business that didn't have "Save the Magic" signs in its window. Across the street was a drugstore, Golden Joe's Pizza Go Go Company, and three or four consignment shops selling everything from old clothes to even older appliances. The whole street had a tired look. Everybody goes to Walmart now, Arthur explained. Grandma says it's a real pity. She used to work in a nice little card shop, but it closed last year. People can buy stuff cheaper at Walmart. I heard my parents complain about the same thing. Dad was still mad about some big hardware chain that drove his favorite store out of business. But I guess that's how it was. People went where they got the best prices. You couldn't really blame them. At last, Arthur stopped in front of the library, a teeny little storefront branch, not even a third of the size of the one back home. Its windows were plastered with "Save the Magic" signs. "I thought you might want to get a library card," he said, dumping his classic Raleigh on the sidewalk. I locked my trek to a bike rack, took off my helmet, and followed him inside. Glad to escape the heat, the librarian, sitting at the information desk, smiled at Arthur. "Well, well," she said, "here's my favorite customer. Who's this with you?" "Logan Forbes," Arthur said. "He just moved into Mrs. Donaldson's house, right next door to me." "Oh, yes. I heard the new art teacher bought the place." She turned her smile on me. "I'm Mrs. Bailey, Logan. Are you a bookworm like my buddy Arthur?" I just kind of shrugged. Here was another person linking me to Arthur. It seemed like there was no escaping it. I was doomed to be Arthur's friend. "Reading's okay," I said, as I took a pen that she offered me and filled out an application for a library card. Like Arthur, I'd been the prize winner in my school's readathon, but I didn't want people thinking that we were just alike. If I hadn't been scared of being caught in a lie, I'd have said I was too busy playing sports to read. That would have set us apart. Arthur was obviously no better at physical stuff than I was. "Well, we'll get you a card in the mail tomorrow or the day after," she promised. "In the meantime, Arthur can let you check out some books on his card." "Sure," Arthur said, "as long as you bring them back on time. I've never had anything overdue in my life." Mrs. Bailey laughed. "Arthur is absolutely exemplary in that regard." "Come on," Arthur said to me. "I'll give you a tour." We went to the children's room first, a small area in the back. I could tell at a glance I had read most of the books. "You can order stuff from other libraries," Arthur said, as if he had guessed what I was thinking. "That's how I read so many last year. I'm not so sure that there are even 500 books in this whole library." We browsed around a while, and in the teen section I found a science fiction paperback that looked good. Arthur picked up The Shining and started flipping through it. "Hey, I've got an idea," he said. "Let's get the newspaper from the day that Mrs. Donaldson was killed so you can read all about it." And without waiting for a response, Arthur headed back to Mrs. Bailey's desk. "Do you remember when Mrs. Donaldson was murdered?" Mrs. Bailey thought a minute or two. 3 years ago, July 17th. I remember because I was baking my daughter's birthday cake. I just counted out 6 candles when I heard the announcement on the radio." "Could we see the newspaper from that day?" Arthur asked. "Logan wants to know everything about it, since it happened in his house and all." "I'll be right back." Mrs. Bailey opened the door, marked "Staff Only," and went inside. "I don't want to read all about it," I muttered. "Yes, you do," Arthur said. I just shrugged. Actually, he was right. I couldn't help being curious, but I didn't want to admit it. Wasn't it kind of morbid? "Here it is." Miss Bailey had reappeared holding a big book. "These are the 2006 Bealsville Post, all bound together in chronological order." Arthur led the way to the reading table and put the book down, turning the pages quickly to find what he wanted. Each time a page turned, motes of dust flew up and tickled my nose. "Voila!" Arthur pointed his grubby little finger on the front page headline dated July 17th. "Myrtle E. Donaldson, murdered in her home," was the headline. Bealsville. "Things like this don't happen in Bealsville," Evan McEwen said when he learned of Mrs. Donaldson's murder. Unfortunately, Mr. McEwen was wrong. Like our big city cousins, our small towns has its own murder to deal with, and everybody is reeling in shock, including the police, who have no leads to the killer's identity. Neighbor discovers the body. Yesterday, Darla Jenkins, age 68, at 4301 Navajo Street, found her neighbor dead at the bottom of the cellar steps. Myrtle E. Donaldson, age 61, died from head injuries resulting from a fall. The house was in disarray, leading police to theorize that Mrs. Donaldson was the victim of a robbery. She was apparently pushed down the steps by an intruder who also tried but failed to kill her dog. So far, the police have no suspects. And then one of the last articles that he looked at on that page will be remembered by many. Mrs. Donaldson will be remembered by many as a ticket taker at the beloved Magic Forest Amusement Park on Route 23 West. She was employed there from 1960 until her untimely death. The only blot on her career was the recent discovery that a large sum of money had been embezzled from the park, and Mrs. Donaldson was questioned more than once, leading some to believe that she was a chief suspect, but no evidence was found linking her to the crime. The theft forced the park's owner, Edward Farrell, into bankruptcy. Consequently, he has no plans to reopen next summer. In fact, he has already received an offer from someone interested in developing the land. Thus ends a tradition of cooling off with Old King Cole, Willie the Blue Whale, Cinderella, and all the other beloved larger-than-life nursery rhyme characters. Another article said, Police Chief at a loss. In his statement to the press regarding Mrs. Donaldson's death, Police Chief Robert Manning refuted allegations of a connection between the murder and the amusement park's missing funds. He has requested that anyone with information about the murder to please step forward. At this time, Chief Manning believes Mrs. Donaldson was the victim of a random killing committed by a stranger passing through Bealsville in search of money or valuables. We hope this proves to be correct and not the beginning of a crime wave in our peaceful little town. And one final article, funeral. Services for Myrtle E. Donaldson will be held at Bradley's Funeral Home on July 22nd at 10 a.m. Burial will follow at Still Waters Memorial Gardens. Mrs. Donaldson, a lifelong resident of Bealsville, was preceded in death by her parents, Daniel and Sophie Atkins, and her husband, Peter Donaldson. She leaves her daughter, Violet Phelps, her son-in-law, Silas Phelps, 2 grandchildren, several nieces and nephews, and numerous friends and relatives. I studied Mrs. Donaldson's smiling photograph. She wasn't the sort of person that you would expect to be getting murdered in her own home or to be suspected of embezzling. Do you think she stole the money? I asked. No way. But you know how it is. People start rumors, and pretty soon most of the town believes she had hidden it somewhere in her house, which could be why Silas Phelps killed her. Silas Phelps? I stared at Arthur. The newspaper said the police had no suspects. Arthur shrugged. Grandma is positive that he did it. But he was her son-in-law. Well, if you'd lived in Bealsville as long as I have, you would understand. The Phelpses and the Jarmans are the worst families in town. They are all related to each other, and the most twisted DNA that you'll ever come across. Grandma says they're directly descended from Cain. Arthur leaned closer. Silas is the worst of the Phelps. You could call him a one-man crime wave. Car theft, armed robberies, drugs, assault. He's been in jail for most of his adult life. Noticing I had gotten kind of tense, Arthur patted my shoulder. You don't have to worry about anything, not even Silas. He's back in jail for holding up a gas station out on Route 703. Used a gun. He's one bad dude. While I sat there picturing Silas as a modern-day Bill Sykes, straight out of Oliver Twist, Arthur turned to the next day's paper, and for about a week the murder was covered, slowly working its way from front-page headlines to back-page paragraphs, tucked in between bicycle thefts and other small-town stuff. But it was always the same. Except for the occasional mention of the embezzled money, there were no clues as to who killed Mrs. Donaldson, or even why. Well, that's it. Arthur got up and stretched, inflating his bony little chest with a deep breath. You want to make some photocopies for your parents? They should know the facts. I reached into my pocket. 4 quarters, 2 nickels, and 3 pennies. More than enough to copy the first article, which was the most important one. And, as Arthur pointed out, the only one that mentioned his grandmother. Make me a copy too, Arthur said. I'll pay you back. Of course, I doubted that, but I made him a copy anyway. Arthur carried the heavy book back to Mrs. Bailey. She took it and handed it to a woman standing beside her. Here you are, she said. It's so odd to have two people wanting the same year of the Bealsville Post on the same day. The woman smiled at Arthur and me. Even though she looked at least 30, she was still really good looking. Long dark hair, pretty eyes, nice mouth, small nose, kind of tall, slim but not skinny. She was built, really built. Arthur and I ogled at her shamelessly. Why would boys your age be reading musty old newspapers? She asked in a friendly way. Arthur gestured at me and said, My friend Logan just moved into the house next door to me. An old lady got killed there 3 years ago. He wanted to see the newspaper story. He held up his copy, which was already creased and dirty, and the lady leaned down to take a look. Her long hair swung against Arthur's cheek, and he blushed. What an amazing coincidence, she said. That's the very story that I'm looking for. How come? Arthur asked, obviously puzzled. I'm an investigative reporter from the Richmond Times, she said, and we're running stories of unsolved crimes that they call cold case files. My editor assigned the Donaldson killing to me. Well, you should talk to my grandmother, she said. She's the one who found the body. See? He stabbed at his photo copy with his finger. That's her, Mrs. Darla Jenkins. My name's Arthur. We live right next door to Mrs. Donaldson's old house, where Logan's living now. The woman opened her purse and pulled out a notebook. Please give me your grandmother's name and phone number. I'll call her. Darla Jenkins. Darlajenkins, Arthur spelled, even though the woman probably already knew how to spell both names. And our number is unlisted, lowering his voice. He whispered the number. She wrote it down carefully. Well, thank you, Arthur. Turning to me, she added, If it's all right with your parents, I'd like to see your house and take some photographs. May I have your parents' name and phone number too? I gave them to her, and she thanked us. My name is Nina Stevens. She handed me a small white card with her name and number on it. Now I must read these articles. It was nice to meet you. I'll see you soon. And with that, she sat down and began poring over the newspaper. Outside, the sun hit my face with a blast from a furnace. I wish I hadn't spent my money on photocopies, because an ice-cold soda sure would have tasted good. We might get in the newspaper, Logan, Arthur said. Maybe she'll even take our pictures. Won't that be something to talk about when school starts? I nodded. But I didn't see why Nina Stevens would want to waste her time photographing us. There was no sense telling Arthur that, though. Let him daydream about being famous if that's what makes him happy.